went on, after she had taken a good look at the insect with its head on, and had thought to herself, I wonder if that's the reason insects are so fond of flying into candles. They want to turn into snapdragonflies. Crawling at her feet, then drew her feet back in some alarm. You may observe a bread and butter fly. Its slices of bread and butter, its body is a crust, and its head is a lump of sugar. It live on. Weak tea with cream in it. A new difficulty came into Alice. Supposing it couldn't find any, suggested. Then it would die, of course. Must happen very often, Alice remarked thoughtfully. It always happens. After this, Alice was silent for a minute or two, pondering. The gnat amused herself meanwhile by humming round and round her head. At last it settled again and remarked, You don't want to lose your name? No, indeed, Alice said a little anxiously. Yet I don't know it, the gnat went on, in a careless tone. Only think how convenient if you could manage to go home without it. For instance, if the governess wanted to call you, she would call out, Come here, and then she would have to, there wouldn't be any name for her to call. And, of course, you wouldn't have to go, you know. Never do, I'm sure, said Alice. The governess would never think of excusing me from lest. If she couldn't remember my name, she'd call me Miss, as servants do. Wesson didn't say anything more, the gnat remarked. Of course you'd miss your last book. I wish you had made it. Why do you think I had made it? It's a very bad joke. But the gnat only sighed. Two large tears came rolling down its cheeks. You shouldn't make jokes as if it makes you unhappy. Then came together. Goodness, sorry. Then came melancholy little sighs, and this time the poor gnat really seemed to have sighed. For when Alice looked up, there was nothing whatever to see on the twig. Getting quite chilly with sitting still so long, she got up and walked on. Soon came to an open field with a on the either side. She very soon came to an open wood on the other side of it. It looked much darker than the last wood, and Alice felt like going into it. However, on second thought, she made up her mind to go on. For I go back, she thought to herself, and this was the only way to the 8th square. It must be the wood, she said to herself thoughtfully. Where things, I wonder what'll become of my name when I go on. I to lose it at all. Because they'd have to give me another, and almost certain to be an ugly one. But then the fun would be trying to find the creature that had got my old name. That's just like Christmas, you know, when people lose dogs. Answers to the name of Dash had on. Just fancy calling everything you meet Alice till one of them answered. Only they all if they were wise. She was rambling on in this way when she read. It looked very cool and shady. Well, at any rate, it's a great comfort, she said, as trees. After being so hot and to get into what? She went on, rather surprised at not being able to. I mean to get under this, putting her hand on the trunk of the tree. What does it call itself, I wonder? I do believe, why, to be sure it hasn't. She stood silent for a moment, and then she suddenly began again. Then it really has happened after all, am I? I will remember if I can. I'm determined to do it. But it didn't help her much, and all she could say, after a great deal of puzzling, I know it begins with L. Just then a fawn by. It looked at Alice with its large, gentle eyes, but didn't seem at all frightened. Here then, Ella said as she held out her hand and tried to stroke it, but it only started a little, and then stood looking at her again. What do you call yourself? The fawn asked. Such a soft, sweet voice it had. I wish I knew, thought poor Alice, answered rather sadly. Nothing just now. Think again, it said. Do. Alice thought, but nothing came of it. "Please, would you tell me what yourself?" she said timidly. "I think that might help a little." "I'll tell you to come a little further on," the fawn said. "I can't remember here." So through the wood, Alice, with her hands clasped lovingly round the soft neck of the fawn, out into the other open field. And here the fawn gave a sudden bound into the air, free from Alice's arms. "I'm a fawn!" it cried out in a voice of delight, "and our human child." A sudden look of alarm came into its beautiful brown eyes, and in another darted away at full speed. Alice stood looking after it, almost ready to cry at having lost her dear little fellow traveller so suddenly. "However, I know," she said. "That's some comfort. Alice, I nearly forgot it. And now, which of these finger posts ought I to follow, I wonder?" It was not a very difficult question to answer, as there was only one road through the wood. Posts both pointed into it. "I'll settle it," Alice said to herself. "Divides, and they point in different ways." But this did not seem very good. She went on and on, a long ways, but wherever the road divided, the two finger posts pointing the same way. One marked, "To Tweedledum's house, to the house of Tweedledee." "I do believe," said Alice, "that they live in the same house. I wonder I never thought of that before. But I can't stay there. I'll just call and say, 'How do you do?' and ask them the way out of the wood. But I could eat the square before it, if only I could get to the 8th square before it gets dark." Wandered off, talking to herself as she did, till on turning a sharp came upon two fat little men, so suddenly that she could not help startling back. The moment she recovered herself, feeling sure that they must be. 4. Tweedledum and Tweedledee. They were standing under a tree, each with an arm round the other's neck, and Alice knew which was which. In one of them had Dum embroidered on his collar, and the other Dee. Each got Tweedle round in the back of the collar. So they stood so still that she quite forgot they were alive, and came round to see if the word Tweedle was written on the back of each collar, when she, by a voice coming from the one marked Dum. "If you think we're waxing, you ought to pay, you know. Waxworks weren't made to be looked at for nothing. Nohow, contrariwise," added the one marked D, "if you think we're alive, you ought—" "I'm sure I'm very sorry," was all Alice could say, for the words of the old kept ringing through her head like the ticking of a clock, and she could hardly help saying, "Tweedledum and Tweedledee agreed to have," for Tweedledum said Tweedledee had spoiled his nice new rattle. Just then flew a crow as black as a tar barrel, which frightened both the heroes so they quite forgot. "I know what you're talking about," said Tweedledum, "but it isn't so. Contrariwise," continued Tweedledee, "if it was so, it might, but if it were so, it would be. But as it isn't, it ain't. That's logic." Thinking, Alice said very politely, "Which was the best way out of the wood? It's getting so dark, please." But the fat little men only looked at each other and grinned. They looked so exactly like a couple of great schoolboys that Alice couldn't help pointing her finger at Tweedledum, saying, "First boy!" Tweedledum cried out briskly, and shut his mouth up again with a snap. "Boy," said Alice, passing on to the Tweedledee, though she felt quite certain he'd shout out "Contrariwise," and so he did. "You've begun wrong," cried Tweedle. "First thing in a visit is to say 'How do you do?' and shake hands." And here they gave each other a hug, and then they held out the two hands that were free to shake hands. Alice did not like shaking hands with either of them first, for fear of hurting the other's feelings. So, as the best way out of the difficulty, she took hold at once. The next moment they were dancing round in a ring. This seemed quite unnatural, she remembered afterward, and she was not even surprised to hear music playing come from the tree under which they were dancing, and it was done as well as she could make it out, rubbed one across the other like fiddles and fiddlesticks. "But it certainly was fun," she said afterward, when she was telling her sister the history of all this. to find myself so round the mulberry bush. I don't know when I began it, and somehow I've been singing it a long, long time." The other two dancers were fat of breath. "4 times round is enough for one dance," Tweedledum panted, and they left off dancing so suddenly as they began. The music stopped at the same. Then they let go of Alice's hands and stood looking at her for a minute. Awkward pause, as Alice didn't know how to begin a conversation with people she had just been. It would never do to say "How do you do" now, she said to herself, to have gone beyond that somehow. "I hope you're not much talk last." "Oh, how, and thank you very much for asking," said Tweedledum. "So much," added Tweedledee. "You like poetry?" "Yes, pretty well, poetry," Alice said doubtfully. "Would you tell me which road leads out of the wood? What shall I repeat to her?" said Tweedledee, looking round at Tweedledum with great solemn eyes, noticing Alice's question. "The Walrus and the Carpenter is the longest," Tweedledum replied, giving his brother an affectionate hug. Tweedledum began instantly. "The sun was shining." Alice ventured to interrupt him. "If," she said, as politely as she could, "would you please tell me first which road?" He replied gently, and smiled gently, and began again. "The sun was shining on the sea, shining with all its might, his very best to make the billows smooth and bright. And this was odd, because it was night. The moon was shining sulkily, because she thought the sun business to be there after the day was done. It's very rude of him," she said to Gun. The sea was wet as wet could be, the sands were dry as dry. No cloud, because no cloud was in the sky. No birds were flying overhead. There were no birds. The Walrus and the Carpenter were walking close at hand. They were wept all to see such quantities of sand. "If this were only cleared away," they said, "it would. If 7 maids with 7 mops swept it for half a year, do you suppose," the Walrus said, "that they could get it clear?" "Doubt it," said the Carpenter, and shed a bitter tear. "Oh, oysters, come and walk with us," they beseech. "A pleasant walk, a pleasant talk along the briny beach. We cannot do more to give a hand to each." The eldest oyster looked at him, but never said a word as he said. The eldest oyster winked his eye and shook his heavy head. He did not choose to leave the oyster bed. But 4 young oysters hurried up, eager for the treat. Their coats were brushed, their faces washed, their shoes were clean, and this was odd, because, you know, they hadn't any feet. 4 other oysters followed yet another 4, and thick and fast they came at last, and more and more and more, leaping through the frothy waves and scrambling to the shore. The Walrus and the Carpenter on a mile or so, and then they rested on a rock conveniently low, and oysters stood and waited in a row. "The time has come," the Walrus said, "to many things, of shoes and ships and sealing wax, of cabbages and kings. The sea is boiling hot, and whether pigs have wings. But wait a bit, the oysters have our chat, for some of us are out of breath, and all of us are fat," said the Carpenter. They thanked him much for that. "A loaf of bread," the Walrus said, "is need. Pepper and vinegar besides are all very good indeed. Now, if you're dear, we can begin to feed." "Not on us," said the oyster cried, turning a little blue. "After such kindness, that would be a do." "The night is fine," the Walrus said. "Do admire the view. So kind of you to come, and you are very nice." The Carpenter said nothing but another slice. "I wish you were not quite so deaf. I've had to ask you twice." "It's a shame," the Walrus said, "to play them such a trick, after we brought them out so far, so quick." The Carpenter said nothing but, "The butter spread too thick." "For you," the Walrus said, "I deeply sympathize." With sobs and tears, those of the largest size, holding his pocket handkerchief before his stream. "Oh, oysters," said the Carpenter, "you've had a pleasant run. Shall we begin?" But answer there came none, and this was scarcely odd, because every one. "I like the Walrus best. Alice said, but was a little sorry for the poor oysters. He ate more than the carpenter, Tweedledee. You see, he held his handkerchief in front, so that the carpenter couldn't count how many you contrariwise. That was mean, Alice said indignantly. Then I liked that he didn't eat, if he didn't eat as many as the walrus. But he ate as many as he could. This was a puzzler. After a pause, Alice began. Then they were both very unpleasant characters. She checked herself in some alarm at hearing something that sounded to her like the puffing of a large wind in the wood near them, though she feared it was more likely to be a wild beast. Are there any lions or tigers about here? She asked timidly. Snoring, said Tweedledee. Come and take a look, the brothers cried, and they seized Alice's hands and led her up to where the king was sleeping. Isn't he a lie? Said Tweedledum. Alice couldn't say honestly that he was. A tall red nightcap on, with a tassel, and he was laying crumpled up, sort of untidy heap, and snoring loud. Fit to snore his head off, as marked. I'm afraid he'll catch cold with lying on the damp grass, said Alice, thoughtful little girl. He's dreaming now, said Tweedledee. And what do you think he's dreaming about? Nobody can guess that. Why, about you, Tweedledee exclaimed triumphantly. And if he left off dreaming about you, where do you suppose you'd be? Well, I am now, where I am now, of course, said Alice. Not you, Tweedledee retorted contemptuously. You'd be nowhere, a sort of thing in his dream. If that their king was to wake, added Tweedledum, you'd be out, bang, just like a can. You shouldn't, Alice exclaimed indignantly. Besides, if I'm only a sort of thing, what are you, I should like to know? Ditto, said Tweedledum. Ditto, cried Tweedledee. He shouted this so loud that Alice could say, Hush! You'll be waking him. I make so much noise. Well, it's no use your talking about waking him, said Tweedledum, when you're only one of the things of his dreams. You know very well you're not real. I am real, began to cry. You won't make yourself a bit realer by crying, Tweedledee remarked. Nothing to cry about. If I wasn't real, Alice said, half laughing through her tears, so ridiculous, I shouldn't be able to cry. I hope you don't suppose those are real tears, Tweedledum interrupted in a tone of great contempt. I know they're talking nonsense, Alice thought to herself, and it's a foolish thing to cry about. So she brushed away her tears and went on as cheerfully as she could. At any rate, I'd better be getting, for really it's coming on very dark. Do you think it's going to rain? Tweedledee had a large umbrella over himself and his brother, and looked up into it. No, I don't, said, at least not under here. No, how? May rain? It may, if it chooses, said Tweedledee. We've no objection, guys. Selfish things, thought Alice, and she was just going to say good night, and Tweedledum sprang out from under the umbrella and seized her by the wrist. Do you see that? Choking with passion, and his eyes grew large and yellow at a moment as he pointed with a trembling finger at a small white thing lying under. It's only a rattle, said Alice, after a careful examination of the little, not a rattlesnake, you know, she added hastily, thinking that he only a little rattle, quite old and broken. I knew it was, cried Tweedledum, stamp about wildly and tear his hair. It's spoiled, of course. Here, Tweedledee, who immediately sat down on the ground and tried to hide under his umbrella, out a hand upon his arm, and said in a soothing tone, You needn't be about an old rattle. But it isn't old, Tweedledum cried in greater fury than ever. It's new, I tell you. I bought it yesterday. My night rattle. And his voice rose to a perfect scream. All this Tweedle's best to fold up the umbrella with himself in it, which was such a thing to do, it quite took off Alice's attention from the angry brother. But he succeeded, and it ended up ended in his rolling over, bundled up in the umbrella, head out, and here he lay, opening and shutting his mouth, and his great eyes uh, looking more like a fish than anything else, Alice thought. Of course, Tweedledum said in a calmer voice. I suppose so, the other sulked as he crawled out of the umbrella. Only she must help us dress up, you know. The brothers went off hand in hand into the woods and returned in a minute with their arms full of things, bolsters, blankets, hearth rugs, tablecloths, dish covers, and coal scuttle. I hope you're a good hand at pinning and tying strings, Tweedledum remarked. Things has got to go on, somehow or other. Alice said afterward she'd seen such a fuss made about anything in all her life. The way they pulled about and the quantity of things they put on, and the trouble they gave her in tying string buttons. Really, they'll be more like bundles of old clothes than anything else. They're ready, she said to herself, as she arranged a bolster around the neck of Tweedledee, head from being cut off, as he said. You know, he added very gravely, the most serious things that can possibly happen to one in a battle to get one's head cut off. Alice laughed aloud, but she managed to turn it into a cough for fear of hurting his feelings. Do I look very pale? Said Tweedledum, coming up to have his... He called it a helmet, though it certainly looked more like a saucepan. Yes, a little, Alice replied gently. I'm very brave, John went on in a low voice. Only today I happen to have a headache. And a headache? Said Tweedledee, who was had overheard the remark. I'm far worse. Then you'd better not fight today, said Alice, thinking it a good opportunity. We must have a bit of a fight, and I don't care about going on long. What's the time now? Tweedledee looked at his watch and said, hour. Let's fight till 6, and then have dinner, said Tweedledum. Very well, the other said rather sadly, and she can watch us. Only it's very close, he added. I generally hit everything I can see. When I get really excited, I hit everything within reach, cried Tweedledum, whether I can see it or not. Alice laughed. You must hit the trees pretty often, I should think, she said. Tweedledum with a satisfied smile. I don't suppose, he said, there'll be a tree left ever so far round by the time we've finished. And all about her was still hoping to make them a little ashamed for fighting for such. I shouldn't have minded it so much, said Tweedledum, if it hadn't won. I wish the monstrous crow would come, thought Alice. There's only one, said Tweedledee to his brother. But if you can have the umbrella, it's quite as sharp. Only we must be getting quick. It's getting as dark as it can. Darker, said Tweedledee, and it was getting dark so suddenly that Alice thought there must be a storm coming on. What a thick black cloud it is, said Alice, and how fast I do believe it's got wings. It's the crow! Tweedledum cried out in alarm, and the two brothers took to their heels and were out of sight in a moment. A little ways into the woods and stopped under a large tree. It can never get to me here. It's far too large to squeeze itself in among the trees, but I wish I wouldn't think so. It makes quite a hurricane in the wood. There's somebody's shawl being blown away. I think this is my favorite part coming up. Chapter 5, Water. She caught the shawl as she spoke and looked about for the owner. The moment the White Queen came running wildly through the wood, with both arms stretched out were flying, and Alice very civilly went to meet her with the shawl. I'm very glad I'm away, Alice said as she helped her to put on her shawl again. The White looked at her in a helpless, frightened sort of way, and kept repeating something that sounded like bread and butter, bread and butter. And Alice felt that if there was conversation at all, she must manage it herself. So she began rather timidly. Am I Queen? Well, yes, if you call that addressing, the Queen said. It isn't the thing at all. Alice thought it would never do to have an argument at the beginning of the conversation, so she smiled and said, If your Majesty will only tell me the right way to begin, as well as I can. But I don't want it done at all, groaned the poor Queen. I've been ill for the last 2 hours. It would have been all the better, as it seemed to, if she had got someone else to dress her. She was tidy. Every single thing is crooked, Alice thought to herself, and she's all over. May I put your shawl straight for you? She added aloud. I don't know what's the matter with it, the Queen said in a melancholy voice. It's out of temper, I think, and I've pinned it there, but there's no pleasing it. It can't go straight, she said, if you put a pin in only one side. On one side, Alice said as she gently put it right for her. And dear me, what a sin! The brush has got tangled in it, the Queen said with a sigh. Yesterday. Alice carefully released the brush and did her best to get the hair in. Come, you look rather better now, she said, after altering most of the pins. I'll have a lady's maid. I'm sure I'll take you with pleasure, the Queen said. You can jam every other day. Alice couldn't help laughing as she said, I don't want you to hire, and I don't care for jam. It's very good jam, said the Queen. Want any today at any rate. You couldn't have it if you, said the Queen. The rule is jam tomorrow and jam yesterday, but never jam today. You must come sometimes to jam today, Alice objected. No, the Queen, it's jam every other day. Today isn't any other day, you know. Understand you, said Alice. It's dreadfully confusing. That's the effect of living backward, said kindly. It always makes one a little giddy first. Leaving backwards, Alice repeated in a great astonishment. I never heard of such a thing. But there's advantage in it that one's memory works both ways. Mine only works one way, Alice remarked. I can't remember things before they happen. That's a brain that only works backwards, the Queen remarked. What sort of things do you remember better to ask? Oh, things that happen the week after next, the Queen replied in a careless instance now, she went on, sticking a large piece of plaster on her finger as she spoke. Queen's messenger. He's in prison now, being punished, and the trial doesn't even begin till next Wednesday. The crime doesn't come at all. That comes last of all. Suppose he never commits the crime. Well, that will be all the better, wouldn't it? The Queen bound the plaster round her finger with a bit of ribbon. Alice felt there was no denying. Of course it would be all better, she said, but wouldn't be all the better. You're wrong there, at any rate, she said. Were you ever only for faults, said Alice, and you were all the better for it, I know, said the Queen. Yes, but then I had done the things I was punished for, said Alice. Difference. But if you hadn't done them, the Queen said, that would have been better, still better and better. Her voice went higher with each better till it got weak at last. Alice was just beginning to say, there's a mistake somewhere, when the Queen began screaming so loud that she had to leave the sentence. Oh, 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 cried the Queen, shaking her hand about to shake it off. My finger's bleeding. Oh, 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 oh. Her screams were so exact of a steam engine that Alice had to hold both hands over her ears. What is it? She said as soon as there was a chance of making herself heard. Have you pricked your finger? Yet, the Queen said, but I shall soon. Oh, oh, oh. When do you expect to do it? Alice asked, feeling very much inclined to laugh. My shawl again, the poor Queen groaned out. The brooch will come undone directly. Oh! As she said the words, the brooch flew open, and the Queen clutched wildly at it and spit again. Take care, cried Alice. You're holding it all crooked. And she caught at the brooch. The pin had slipped, and the Queen had pricked her finger. Oh, that accounts for the bleed, see, she said to Alice with a smile. Now you understand the way things happen here. But why don't you scream now? Alice asked, holding her hands ready to put over her ears again. Why, I've done all the screaming already, said the Queen. What would be the good of having it? By this time it was getting light. The crow must have flown by, Alice. I'm glad it's gone. I thought it was the night coming on. I could manage to be glad, the Queen said. Only I never can remember the rules. Be very happy living in this wood, and being glad whenever you like. It is very lonely here. Alice said in a melancholy voice, and at the loneliness 2 large tears came rolling down her cheeks. "Oh, don't go on like poor Queen," wringing her hands in despair. "Consider what a great girl you are. Consider the way you've come today. Consider what o'clock it is. Consider anything, only don't cry." Alice could not help laughing at this, even in the midst of her tears. "Can you keep from crying things?" she said. "That's the way it's done," the Queen said with great decision. "But he can do 2 things at once, you know. Let's consider your age to begin with. I'm 7½ exactly." "You needn't say exactly," Queen remarked. "I can believe it without that. Now I'll give you something to believe. I'm just 101 and a day." "I can't believe that," said Alice. "Can't you?" The pitying voice. "Try again. Draw a long breath and shut your eyes." Alice laughed. "There's no use trying," she said. "One can't believe impossible things." "I dare say you haven't had much practice," said the Queen. "When I was your age I always did it for a day. Why, sometimes I believed as many as 6 impossible things before breakfast. Shall again." The brooch had come undone as she spoke, and a sudden gust of wind blew all across the little brook. The Queen spread out her arms again and went flying after. This time she succeeded in catching it herself. "I've got it!" she cried in a triumphant tone. "You shall see me pin it on again, all by myself." "Then I hope your finger is better now?" very politely, as she crossed the little brook after the Queen. "Oh, much better!" cried the Queen, rising into a squeak as she went on. "Much better, 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 better!" The last word ended in a long bleat, so Alice was quite startled. She looked at the Queen, who seemed to have suddenly wrapped up in wool. Alice rubbed her eyes and looked again. She couldn't make out what was she in a shop, and was it really a sheep that was beside the counter? Rub as she would, she could make nothing more. She was in a little dark shop, leaning with her elbows on the counter, and opposite to her was Pete, sitting in an armchair knitting.